Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm TC Ricks /Rhombus Tix, and I will be reading Chapter 13 from Micronation. Hallelujah. I arrived at the United States without much incident, until, that is, I reached the custom desk where they started asking me questions. The custom agent's eyes bulged when she saw my Hler stamp. She entered the information to the computer and frowned even more. "I'm sorry, Mr. Arthurson, but I can't let you into the country." "Excuse me?" Was there no escaping prowl? "Well, you apparently renounced your U.S. citizenship. It says so right on your file." She sounded suspicious and potentially sympathetic. In retrospect, I think it was pity, really. "I did no such thing." "I'm afraid the computer says you did." "Well, the computer is wrong. Can I talk to your superior?" A moment later, a very annoyed man in a bad suit, came in his 30s, approached me and said, "Mr. Arthurson?" "Yes?" "I think I can explain your current situation. It seems the current U.S. law states that any title of royalty or peerage accepted by a U.S. citizen without authorization by the U.S. Congress is considered a revocation of one's citizenship." I was floored. Why hadn't anybody told me this? I was never informed of that fact. "Actually, you were. It was in a document faxed to me by the U.S. Embassy in Russian." He showed it to me. It was a document signed and dated by me revoking my United States citizenship for a title with Hler. I didn't remember signing that form. There had been a lot of forms I'd had to sign, but as a contractor I'd gotten in a habit of reading the fine print. What if I'd missed one? What if I hadn't and someone had signed for me and I'd missed one? Worse, what if I hadn't missed it and I'd been framed? Who would I turn to? Better safe than sorry. I didn't sign that document. "Well, the U.S. Embassy in Russia says you did. I want to see my lawyer. I'm afraid, since you are not a U.S. citizen, we are under no obligation to allow you to see a lawyer." He was quite smug on that point. I was doubly shocked. "You're accusing me of being a terrorist?" "I am neither confirming nor denying it." "This is insane. Are you arresting me?" "No." "So what? I have to stay in the airport like in that crazy movie?" "No, of course not." He smirked and dropped his pencil. "Then what am I supposed to do?" "You might want to call a lawyer." He smiled. What? This was definitely insane. I said, "We are under no obligation to allow you to see one. However, you may contact a lawyer at your own time and expense." I was about to let him stick his shiny U.S. State Department plastic ID up his left nostril, or perhaps in even more unpleasant places, when I calmed down. He was probably waiting for me to give him an excuse so they could lock me up and send me back to secret prison again. Not that they really needed an excuse, but it probably would have helped. I left the annoying man and moved to the payphone. The Yellow Pages had lots of lawyers, but I wanted someone good. Not just some random schmuck. I decided that I would do a Google search on a few of them to see what their reputation was. I got an email when I was looking. Apparently, a lawyer had found me. He offered to represent me for free. I was suspicious, but I'm also a cheap bastard as well. Couldn't hurt to at least meet the guy. So he shows up after a half an hour. He was a typical lawyer, 40s, white, male, suit, black briefcase, the works, really. The only thing that set him apart was a tiny NASA lapel on his jacket, which meant Hler. I was right, of course. "Mr. Arthurson, pleased to see you. I believe we can help you resolve this situation." My curiosity gets the best of me in such situations, so I said, "Sure, why not? Okay, I'll bite. What insanely cartoonish Hler strategy is there this time?" He looked somewhat offended by this, but didn't immediately back down. Instead, he said, "Well, the long and the short of it is this. If the State Department recognizes your title, it recognizes Hler. Since you lost your citizenship in the U.S. by taking the title in Hler, either it means the U.S. recognizes Hler, or you never lost your citizenship. We feel the very fact that they took this action validates Hler's claim." That gave me an idea. "You're fired." I could see why certain people got off on that idea. "But you didn't even hire me." "Still fired, but go away. You're blocking my sunlight." So I went to the local newsstand and got a newspaper. I began reading through it, looking for local crime cases. Being an enemy of the state, I selected one of the law firms representing a drug dealer. Don't get me wrong. I don't like people like this, but if I'm going to have a lawyer, he or she isn't going to be working for Hler. Think about it. I found it highly unlikely the lawyer paid by Hler was going to go for the Hler is not a nation and therefore you have to renounce your citizenship angle. Apparently they took me for an idiot. A phone call later, and suddenly I had one of the best lawyers in town on my side. 1 hour after that, the smart aleck State Department employee calls me back and apologizes. The moral of the story is money works. Money might not be not buy happiness. Money might not buy friends, but apparently having it drastically reduces the odds of tiny little things bothering you, like government bureaucrats with delusions of grandeur. The lawyer I hired seemed pretty pedestrian. This was not a bad thing. I refuse to believe that every politician, every lawyer, Tom, Dick, and Harry actually belongs to some secret conspiracy. Use the big lawyer to crash the gate, use the smaller lawyer to do the drudge work. That meant my lawyer was working for me. It was underhanded to use the hammer lawyer to get the visa back into the United States and then fire them and get a normal lawyer to get the actual work done. But that was the way the world worked now. I made my fortune finding people to connect to work who didn't want to bother doing it themselves. In fact, I now knew that the mighty senior partners were going to assign my case to some junior partner who was probably not even as skilled as the little guy specialist I'd hired. Plus, I had a good feeling about him when I talked to him on the phone. Since I'd been at Hler the last few months, I didn't have really have a home to go to. I'd worked for Prowl for years before I'd been sent to prison, so I rented a set of corporate suites near the airport. I found that Hler was not America. Hler was better than prison, but my home country was not Hler. My home country was the United States. It was a shame we had to vote for people like President Hamburger. It was a shame that we let ourselves be sold so much crap, memes. The more I thought about them, the more I realized just how they were going to change the world, and I'd helped. I had been there. The rational part of my mind argued about exactly what specific things I could have done to put the genie back in the bottle, and I had to admit, I couldn't think of exactly what to do. I had to check my email. I didn't want to, but while my own association with Hler was through, my contracts weren't, and I had to do my job. It took an hour. I had messages from the higher-ups at Hler and ignored them. I was no saint, but to borrow a phrase from Prowl, I had no truck with monsters either. I was just about to close up shop for the day when I couldn't help but notice an email from one Colonel Salamander from the Air Force. It read as follows. Mr. Chester Arthurson, it is my understanding that you recently left the corporate island known as Hler. I have been informed by a mutual business associate who, I assure you, is not on the Hler board, that you left because of a rather disturbing technological trend. I would be very interested in talking to you about it. Colonel Salamander. Well, that was interesting. Which conspiracy did he work for, the communists or the fascists? Or was it an entirely separate thing? Hler and Prowl were dangerous, but so was the government. So what was I supposed to do? I decided I liked daylight. I emailed him back. Dear Colonel Salamander, I'm sorry to say that my initial experience with Hler was, in part, due to a rather disappointing interaction with the U.S. government. You want to know what I know about memes? They're bad. Very bad. I know our government and Hler both have the technology. I'm not a psychologist or an engineer. I've seen the life of a woman utterly ruined by them. If you need to send your men, then do so, but I'm done with the secret world. If I am forced, then I'm forced, but I will never enter the shadow world voluntarily again. Have a nice day, Chester A. Arthurson. I watched TV and then took a nap. Then I ordered room service. Much to my surprise, there was not a ninja waiting to kill me when I opened the door. Maybe I could get my life back. Maybe. I did know that I intended to keep a very low profile until Prowl was not after me anymore. Fortunately, he was stupid. Several days passed. At least it seemed the world was no longer trying to pester me. The emails from Hler managed to slow to a trickle. I think they got the idea that I thought that they were unbearable scum. Prowl kept trying to send me emails on false names. He used the same IP address each time he did it. The U.S. government quietly dropped their case against me, and I continued to get rich administering contracts in Hler. I began to regain my sense of purpose in the world. I would get rich, have a family, do good, and enjoy myself. I had gotten lucky. Things could have been far worse. I was prepared to deal with any random appearances by Prowl. I had even had my lawyer, Lexington, drop a restraining order against the lunatic ahead of time, just in case. Thus, I was a bit surprised when Colonel Salamander sent me another email. Dear Mr. Arthurson, memes were not the technology I had in mind when I first contacted you. I was a bit surprised you mentioned them. I have looked into Hler's efforts and those of the U.S., and I must say that I'm enthralled yet horrified at the same time. I'm given to understand there are answers to other questions you are looking for here in Colorado Springs. Colonel Salamander. I immediately replied, Dear Colonel Salamander, I am interested in answers, but not at the cost of my own soul. All things Hler are dangerous. Please send anything you wish to discuss with me by email, and I will consider it. Chester Arthurson. I did not hear any immediate replies. I tried to think of what he was talking about, but the explanation escaped me. There was a knock at the door 3 days later. It was an impressive feat because I took rather extreme steps to keep Hler people from finding me. I always paid in cash. I always stayed in a separate place each night, and I only had my phone enabled for random 15-minute increments during the day. The rest of the time, I took the battery out. I looked through the people and saw an Air Force officer in his early 20s looking back at me. Then I checked out the window and saw two very burly-looking Marines in a waiting car. This was rather interestingly high profile. I looked out the back window of the hotel room and didn't see anyone waiting. Good. I very carefully opened it, popped out the panel screen, I loaded up my travel bag, and then attached a rope ladder onto the window. The knocking on the door grew louder, but I ignored it as I proceeded to climb down 6 stories. The fact that I could still hear the nice, clean-cut young man at the bottom was a testament to his persistence and optimism. I yanked down the rope ladder and patiently rolled it up and put it into my pack. He hadn't broken down the door. Fascinating. I reached into my bag and pulled out a vial of cow's blood and sprinkled it at the base of the window, leaving a few drops on the trail towards a nearby manhole cover. I finally heard the door burst open, and then triggered the flashbang grenade I had set up with the tripwire. It allowed me to slip into the back door of a first-floor apartment I'd had the hooker rent for me using cash. She wasn't present. I didn't want her to stick around. I pulled out a bag of corn chips and watched with interest from the webcam I'd left on the shelf upstairs as the Marines looked out the window, the trail of blood, and the manhole cover. It was priceless. So what was I supposed to do next? My ruse wouldn't fool them forever. Of course, they obviously wanted to keep everything secret, otherwise the apartment complex would now be swarming with police, and my escape would have been meaningless. I considered my options. They may have been using spy satellites to find me, though I rather suspected that was a bit much. Again, 1 officer and 2 Marines do not a conspiracy make. I could go public. A normal media outlet could be manipulated, but if it was too small, then it might be dismissed. There were several webcasts that reported on the local news that I could go to, but the publicity was only a shield in some ways. That, and quite frankly, I still dreaded the prospect of living a public life like that. Then again, my current lifestyle was hardly ideal. Granted, I had been living like this to avoid Prow, but this put things in a good light. I could not keep hiding, and I could not make people think me worthless unless Prow stopped valuing me. My life was no longer my own. Then again, when do any of us truly retain control over who we are? I sat there, staring through the webcam at the annoyed Marine that crawled out of the sewer. I still had no answers. Well, no answers except that I didn't want to walk up to that Marine and laugh at him just now.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Welcome to the secret commentary after the episode. So, this is one of those things that I thought was kind of interesting because it was neither good nor bad. This is a nuts and bolts chapter, so I'm going to give it a default B. It definitely wasn't an A, and I can't really call it a C, and minuses don't really factor in too much here. I think I've always been fascinated with the concept of head of state versus head of government. I never got head of state, really, until I saw The Crown. I always saw head of state as kind of like ribbon cutting, and I saw the value in it. And I understood, especially after spending some time with the Mythic Journeys folks, that culture can be shaped. In fact, I still argue, and have argued for quite some time, that the power of the presidency, it was at its greatest, not as the head of the military, not as the head of the government, not as any other duties that the president has, but as head of state. His ability to get in that pulpit and speak is heavily able to influence the narrative. Now, that part of the office has probably been irrevocably damaged by a certain orange clown, but nevertheless, it is an incredibly powerful tool to allow a president to try and sway the dialogue, to sway public opinion, much more than, trying to convince Congress to do something. In fact, when a president, tours a disaster area and pretends to look concerned, it's not just politics. That's the things a head of state does. The head of state is the personification of the state, and that's the thing I learned from The Crown. And so the president, thanks to Washington, represents the image of the government, the image of, frankly, America. Love him or hate him, he is the official embodiment, both by law and by proxy, of what people to consider to be the symbol and focal point of the narrative of our country. And just like the storyteller or the bard in ancient times around the campfire, a story is told that is America, and the chief storyteller is the president. So when you have a new country that lots of factions and countries have a definite economic incentive to control, they will, of course, do petty, stupid shit like what they did here. Well, you became the king of Hler. Well, technically by law, you can't accept titles of royalty. But the counter-argument by Hler to say, so you're saying that you legally recognize us then. And this is a real thing. The most prominent country that I researched in putting this together, Sealand, went to all kinds of elaborate, sometimes practically hoaxes, sometimes real things, to get other countries to recognize them legally. One of the things that Chester said earlier in the narrative, I think in the last chapter, where when there's a new country, there's two ways of recognizing a country, right? One is by formal recognition, like, passing a law that says, we, the United States of America, recognize that Taiwan is the rightful government of China. Or then later they can say, we, the United States of America, recognize that mainland China is the government of China, right? So there's official, and then there's by proxy. And for example, there's a country in Somalia that they don't want to recognize because the barrier in the international community is very high to get a country recognized. And it basically almost always requires the original country to agree to divide itself. The closest exception to that, I would argue, is Kosovo. And I'm not going to open that can of worms for commentary on a novel. I might some other time when I talk about sovereignty, which always has fascinated me. But there's a reason for that, which is much more relevant to what we're speaking of. And that is primarily countries like Spain and England. Spain is obsessed with making sure that democratic sovereignty is really, really difficult and requires the host nation because, well, and more recently, China, too. China's is obvious, right? If China wants the host, the recognized host country to be the one to decide it, because then otherwise Taiwan can become independent, right? But more importantly, China was complicated because it was technically a civil war. And most of the time, the few exceptions to a country trying to get recognized in the UN is actually basically the result of a civil war, like Ethiopia and Eritrea, Sudan and South Sudan. And usually it's frankly not just any civil war. It's like a huge, huge civil war. I think East Timor is the one exception to that. And that's because, frankly, it's tiny. And West Timor, they were kind of jerks to East Timor. So there are exceptions to the rules. But most of the time, it's basically who has the heavier diplomatic stick, right? International law, to be totally honest, isn't. There's no real such thing as international law. You can make the argument that all law is illusion, right? Because, for example, if the government passes a law that says alcohol is illegal, then it's only as real as both as the government can enforce and as the people agree, right? So, for example, if a society has a law that says, murder is illegal, right? Most people agree to that. The government itself, i.e., the part of the largest armed group that is able to control this territory that the other armed groups around it agree to, then in terms of the legal ramifications, if in the Depression, in the 20s, they were able to find you and arrest you with alcohol on you, or FBI investigation to indicate that you were with organized crime, and they want, which by the way in the 20s they very rarely did, because J. Edgar Hoover wanted nothing to do with the mafia until he was literally forced to. But my point is that Prohibition, and to a later extent the drug war, failed because the populace, or at least a significant chunk of the populace, just wasn't buying what they're selling. Which is why we had this little thing called the Civil War with regards to slavery, where you had vast differences in geographic distribution, and something where the regions simply would not agree on that. And I'm pretty sure that abortion is going to end up being the same way. If we, people have been talking about a second civil war in this country for decades. Frankly, since I would argue the 60s. And at this point, if there's anything that actually finally pushes us over the edge, unless, of course, there's a coup attempt by the Republican Party, it's going to be abortion. Because if the national government formally recognizes a woman's right to choose, then certain states are going to basically be in open revolt of that. And in that state, it will only be as effective at enforcing it as the federal government is able to do so. In the case of, for example, segregation, Eisenhower literally had to send in the freaking army to enforce Brown versus education. So my point of going into all this about the difference between the head of state and the head of government is a head of state helps a populace accept the dictates of the state, right? The head of government is basically, I can fire you or I can impeach you all the way down the food chain, from the top of the food chain to the president, all the way down to the bottom of a federal special agent with arrest power, right? But in terms of getting people to obey the law, right? There's enforce the law and then there's obey the law. And obey the law is what you can get away with unless you internalize that law, right? So the point being that the head of state exists in modern democracies because, well, first of all, it's a vestige of the concept of the British crown, and they wanted an excuse to keep the crown around, and it made them look prestigious and added to the legitimacy of the state after nationalism took place. But in addition to that, the reason they keep them around in almost every country, I can't think of a single country in the world, any, that does not have a head of state. In addition to the head of government. Now, they are sometimes in the same person, but they all have a head of state, right? And that head of state is, notified to each other state about the proper diplomatic protocols and titles and so on and so forth. It's embedded in our very concept of diplomacy, but it's also embedded in our very psyche about nationalism. And nationalism is basically the underpinning of our concept of the state. So when you have a situation where you have these games between larger and smaller powers, that's not new. Think about it, right? Even back in the Roman Empire, right? There were huge semantics, but also economic arguments about, are you a principality? Are you a client state of Rome? Are you a kingdom? Are you a separate kingdom? Right? And sometimes it was a matter of, what Rome wanted it to be. And sometimes it was a matter of what different factions in Rome wanted it to be. And at the end of the day, that goes back, you read in the Old Testament about, the alignment between Israel and the countries that conquered it in the latter half of the Old Testament. And you see another example of, complicated dynamics between an emperor and his feudal kings and feudal vassals, right? Are you a duke? Are you an earl? If you're a duke, do you have the ancestral right to this particular piece of land? And claims and counterclaims are a big deal. For example, when there's a reason why in movies and books you read about the Middle Ages, why, somebody will find a bastard of the king. Think of Game of Thrones, right? Why does a bastard of the king matter? Well, the bastard of the king matters because he can give a faction of the throne enough legitimacy to give the narration of state, i.e. the bloodline, a reason to do what they're doing. And this gets even more fascinating when you look at the root of religion and the attempt by many religions, and it's not just monotheism, to go back to the ancients and say, I can trace my line of legitimacy and power to this religion and this religion and this religion, and this guy was, this is in, but that's out. And, the symbolism of the narrative is a huge, huge deal.